Ready.
Hello, hello, hello. That's better. I'd muted my mic for you lot, which was a touch on the stupid side, but there you go. So welcome to the new show, the really, really catchily named Gary Gets His Friends to Hang Out on Stream and Teach Him Stuff show. Maybe the name should be changed. We'll see. But I'm really, really, really excited to have Ciaran on as the first guest because Ciaran's... I guess we could say we're friends, Ciaran, right? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Oh, I
let's say
think
that.
it is, right? Yeah, we're good friends. So hang out at conferences, drink beer, generally talk about stuff. I always remember the time when we were, I think it was the conference in Texas, was it? Which one was which
It
Lone
was the
Star.
Lone Star.
Yes.
Lone,
Yes, and we
and we were on a completely different time zone to everyone else.
correct. Yeah, we would like drinking beer from 2 till 6 and then going to bed at 6 o'clock and waking up at like 4 a.m. It was kind of cool. That was a really nice trip.
Yeah.
But I
Hmm.
guess, so yeah, do you want to introduce yourself? Do you want to tell the world what you do?
Oh, crikey. So I'm a software developer. What I've been doing for the last few years, I guess the last 5 or 6 years, is more in the area of coaching and consulting. So a lot of that's around agile, and a lot of that's around testing. And the kind of intersection of those two things is BDD. So at the moment, I'm an independent consultant. Hire me if you want to. And what we're going to talk about today, right, is example mapping, which is something I've been doing with customers quite a lot, as a way of bridging that kind of step in the process where someone's got an idea for a feature and then someone's going to build it. And a lot of the problems in software development happen in that interim,
Okay.
in that bit in the middle.
So
Um,
this is kind of related to the whole area around BDD and specs and all those keywords that I'm regurgitating without really understanding what they mean, right? So because an example has always confused me. So in this case, is the example like an example of using the feature? Is that where the term example comes from?
yeah, let's go into that. I mean, how have you seen requirements written down, Gary? There's loads of different ways of doing it, right? You often get a load of old stuff in a
Yeah.
Jira ticket.
The best
Um,
way, so yeah, it's varied, right? In some of the projects I've done as a consultant, the requirements have been somebody giving you a call and you frantically trying to make notes and then trying to deliver what you think they
mhm,
want and then them saying, no, that's not what I wanted at all. It's ranged from that to like
yeah,
when I worked at the
yeah,
BBC, there was product owners and a more traditional, I guess, agile environment where the requirements would be written down by a third party whose job it was to represent the users as a stakeholder in and though in those instances
yeah,
the requirements could be almost overly complicated in some regards, but I'd rather have that,
yeah.
right? They would be written down as I don't, and then of course you've got like user stories and all that stuff. As a user, I want to be able to do this because of that or whatever. So yeah, I've seen it written in a few different ways.
Yeah, so the context of this is sort of agile teams, right? So it's BDD is very much a kind of agile practice. So you take the agile ideas that you don't want to have written all these specs years in advance. You don't want to have invested loads of time researching and writing up something that might never get built. So it's a kind of, you want to be having just enough information that someone can build it, the right information, and be really sort of crystallizing that idea just in time, so just before someone's going to start work on it. So uh, in BDD, an important practice is using examples like you mentioned, because two different reasons, right? Traditional requirements are often a mixture of two things: rules and examples. So a rule is more generic, more general, and it's more like an algorithm. It's like this is something that's going to cover lots of different situations that might happen in the system. This is a business rule that we've decided is important for the system to deliver whatever value we want. So it's either stopping people doing something or it's enabling something. That's kind of a rule. I guess you've been building a game, right? So the idea of a rule is quite natural in a game. And the problem with rules is they're quite hard to understand because they're so broad. So a way to understand rules is to give really concrete examples of how the rule would be applied in a specific situation. So often in those big requirement documents, there's a lot of rules going on. And maybe if someone's remembered to ask the question, they've said, so what would happen in this situation? You've got a few of those examples. And the examples are living, they're there to make sure you understand the rule.
I see.
So there's an example I give. So like if you tell me what the rule of the game is, you know when you're playing a board game and you're like reading out the rules? It's quite possible for you to read out the rule and for me to go, yep, I understand.
Yeah.
And we've got completely different understandings of what that actually means in practice, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's what you see a lot. You see that a lot in software. You know, they say this is what should happen. You know, God, I can't think of an example now. An example from one of my talks is sales tax is 20%. Yeah. Right, so you can write that in a requirements document, and everyone nods and kind of understands. Yeah, I understand sales tax. But if you take someone from America and you ask them to give an example of it, they'll say, okay, sales tax being 20% means that if the price is $10, when you buy it, you actually have to pay $12, and $2 goes to the tax man.
Weirdos.
That's an example, right? So, yeah. So what makes it an example is it's specific, and it's got some detail in it. The $10 is kind of an arbitrary detail, but it's making it real. And it's got a specific output. So if your understanding of sales tax is different to mine, it's really easy to detect that through that concrete example.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
So the European person says, that's not how it works. If it says 10 euros on it and sales tax is 20%, that means is you're going to pay 10 euros, and we're going to record that we owe the tax guy. It's not a round number, is it?
No, and doing that in your head.
€1.66. 66.
Yeah, I could never have done that. That's fine under this kind of pressure, but
it's only because I added the slide already.
It's perfect, right? That's I totally get you what you mean there. That's a great example. Yeah.
So it's like, and if you think about how that relates to the idea of a test case, there's a strong alignment there. So that example, I've given that example to make sure everyone understands how the sales tax should work as part of a conversation. But if I capture that and I make sure in the code base there's a unit test that buys something for 10 euros and checks that I get charged 10 euros. You know, so put something in the data, lists a product at 10 euros, goes to buy it, checks I got charged 10 euros, checks that the ledger of how much we owe HMRC has increased by that amount, then I've sort of validated that the end point, the system at the end, has fulfilled the business requirements.
That's really interesting.
So I've got strong confidence that the system has that rule in it somewhere.
And, well, how? So my sort of confusion on this, and we've spoken about this in the past, right? A couple of times, and I've always sort of thought this is a really good idea, but like my kind of, I guess my confusion around this are, we call those are a different type of tests from unit tests or functional tests or acceptance tests or whatever we've traditionally had in our test suite, right?
I would call them acceptance tests, but you could, because a lot of these terms are overlapping, you can call them business acceptance tests.
Because like to me, acceptance tests I always think of as like end-to-end browser-based tests where if I click on there, if I type this in here and type that in there and click submit, I get logged in. Like that's my, and you know, we're all woolly about these these names, apart from unit tests, which I think we all agree with what they should look like. No?
I've seen
Yeah.
So what I would say is that if you think about the rule as actually being something that's going to live in the
Yeah.
code, the rule is that 20% sales tax is being implemented somewhere. And what level you test that, well, you can think of it two ways around. If it's an existing system, you have to test at the level that will include that rule. So you imagine a legacy system where that rule is implemented in a controller.
Yeah.
You're going to have to be testing a scope of the system that includes the controller. Or if it's implemented as a database trigger, you're going to have to be running a test that's including that database trigger.
That makes sense. Yeah. Makes perfect sense.
Or if it's got like a hexagonal architecture thing where all your domain model is in pure objects in the center, you can probably just test at that level.
Yeah, okay.
So you might have a boundary around that of use case oriented services. So there's a service that says buy the product. You can apply that test at that level. So it kind of depends on the architecture. Flipping that around, for new stuff, the layer you decide to test that at is going to force you to implement it at that layer. So if you say all our business acceptance tests are going to be at that domain model boundary, the rules all have to be in there.
Yeah, of course they do.
If you're only testing end to end, the sort of sneaky developer can implement the sales tax in the JavaScript in the browser.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which might be okay for some systems, right? But it makes you think. It sort of connects those ideas of what layer you're testing at with how you want the architecture to look.
That's intriguing. So like one of the hardest things for me as a developer, and like I joke here that I'm the developer evangelist and you're the real developer in the heads up the names, but you know I've done a lot of this stuff as a consultant where we've gone in and we've retrofitted tests to legacy, and I've worked a ton on legacy. And what I haven't done a lot of is like greenfield brand new projects in my career. I did at the BBC, but that was like a JavaScript project with pre-existing opinions. And I always struggle with, okay, so this is obviously a symptom of me not doing TDD enough, right? Because if I'm asking myself, what tests should I be writing to test this? That's a symptom of the fact I'm not doing TDD. But, you know, it comes... So my attitude has always been, my opinions are shaped by the work that I've done and the experiences I've had, right? And I've always worked on legacy code bases, and I've always had skills in retrofitting tests to previous code bases. And so I tend to think about solving the problem first and adding the test second. And I'm not saying that's the best way to do something, definitely, but it's the best way for me to do something given the way I think and my current skill set. So I always struggle to think, what test should I write to test this, right?
Yeah, and people often start doing BDD at the test layer, but I do some teaching for Cucumber. Example mapping was invented by a guy at Cucumber, and we try and emphasize that like it's applied at different steps in the process, and the step we're talking about maybe today is the first step, which they talk about it as discovery being the first step, discovering what you're going to build. And then you find out what Cucumber is.
It's fine.
So like that business conversation level, this is a useful practice. And you should introduce that first maybe. And then later you start using some of the outputs as testing. Because it's a bit harder to introduce it if you're already, especially around legacy, if you're already trying to write tests around legacy, you kind of can't do a process where you're driving it based on business requirements because you don't know what they were.
Yeah.
With a legacy system, the business requirements are it should do what it does.
Yeah.
It should do what it does right now.
It's awesome. Okay.
And it shouldn't stop doing that.
So, and so you're,
which is it's natural for legacy systems to be like that, right? Because they're the reason you've got a 10-year-old system running 90% of your business is that it worked. Your business
And it
didn't
still
die.
works.
You didn't scrap
As
it.
Rob Allen says to me,
You might not
he
know
likes to call legacy systems profitable systems because legacy has such a negative connotation on it, right? And as I say, I've worked a ton on legacy stuff. And good morning to the Flying Dev, and hello to Jim Second, and hello to Copper Beardy. I've missed my duties as chat. So yeah, you're involved with PHP Spec, right? And PHP Spec is a tool designed around writing your tests more like examples with the way you're constructing your actual test names and such and such and such. You can tell I'm floundering, but it's fine.
Yeah, PHP Spec is it's a BDD tool. It's aimed at developers writing tests for themselves. So the thing we were just talking about was kind of use case oriented. So one step in one of those tests might involve a bunch of services and maybe some infrastructure. Buying a product. But that's the level at which you can effectively engage business people and have them understand what you're talking about. Inside that, you've got loads of objects that someone's had to design, and they're sort of saying, oh, should I make it a singleton? Maybe not. Should we use decorator pattern here? How are these things going to talk to each other? That's the level of testing that PHP Spec's aimed at. So it's doing that TDD-like cycle, writing an example of what a class should do, then implementing it. So it's the same sort of activity, but it's at a deeper level inside the code. And so it's not one where you're really trying to engage non-technical people. It's more one where you're trying to write some tests that explain what a class does, so that other people can understand it, and it helps your workflow, how you're building it. So you can sort of think of those as different levels of granularity.
That's awesome.
So the tools I'd tend to use for the sort of business acceptance tests are, the natural one is BHAT, or another outside of PHP that would be Cucumber, or any testing framework. So we can maybe avoid talking about BHAT today when we talk about testing. What tests have you got existing on your project? What are you using? Please tell me.
So this is where you absolutely and utterly get to judge me, and I'm totally fine with Ciaran judging me, because, like, as I always say, people who are more experienced in certain things than I am get to judge me, but people who are less experienced don't. So you get to judge me. We have this weird. So the way this started was, and this I hope this will be interesting to you, because this is a Laravel project, right? So if we take a look, you saw an early incarnation of this at PHP UK, right, where we were playing the game, and so you'll recognize the game, but you'll see that it's changed quite a lot in how it looks, because now it looks like a real game. So we've got and the game is exactly the same. The rules under the hood are exactly the same. Let me hide the cam a sec, because chat can now play. So good morning, chat. We've done a Twitch plugin, so instead of having to text, we can play a move using Twitch. And you can see the move is played, but it's the same game as the one you saw, right? It just looks a bit better, right? So it's pretty good. So we've done this, but really the only thing that we've done that's different is the pretty front end. All of the back end stuff I'm quite proud of, because all of the domain logic is in a different namespace than the actual app, which is just a Laravel app, because I just wanted some basic routing and stuff out of the box. There's nothing that we need Laravel for in this app. Also, if I put Laravel in stream titles, I get much more people watching, so I can honestly say that. So that's fine. So everything's in here, right? And we have a PHP unit XML in here, and we have a test suite, and we have unit tests. And actually, the test suite is in tests now. Here, chat them on. And we just have unit tests here. I haven't really gone for anything else.
Do you have any functional tests?
I literally only have unit tests. Look, if you look at my to-do list, tests have been on here about 30 times that I haven't done. So, and realistically, right, what I would like to have here, if this was a commercial product where I was shipping this, what I feel like I need at this point are only really controller tests for the Laravel application. Because it's a single page application in the front end, right? There's no user interaction. Right. You can't click on anything here. All the interaction is done from a third party.
Or maybe you want JavaScript
Maybe
tests.
I want JavaScript tests. Like I've written tests for React components before. I totally should be doing that in the front end. But for the sake of this conversation, I'd be happier if we could concentrate on the back end. Like if that would be okay with you.
Yeah. But let's talk about those two levels of testing. So one is like, does each component work? So you imagine in a factory that's building some complicated machine, there's tests around each component that it conforms to what it should, there's a specification, here's the tolerances, here's what it should do. And that's kind of how I think about unit tests. And that's something that developers have to do for themselves. So if you are writing tests around your front end components, that's fine. If you're not, that's probably also fine. Similarly, in PHP, if you're writing unit tests for each class, I think you're going to get a lot of benefits, especially if you're doing TDD. But if you don't do that, then from a business QA perspective, knowing all your classes do what they're meant to do doesn't help tell us whether the system fits its business spec, right?
Yes.
So what I think you could introduce maybe after we do the example mapping, we can talk about how you would introduce
that's great.
that kind of acceptance level tests. Now, if you're not doing unit testing and you're just doing acceptance testing, you'll probably find the acceptance tests fail all the time. And you'll probably also find you get loads of bugs for things that weren't covered by the conversation with the business, because it's just sort of good practice to have that quality lower down. But you'll have something that runs and says, remember that thing we talked about before when we were talking about how it should operate? I've got a test that proves it does that. Now, those acceptance tests, it depends where you're implementing the rules in your project, right?
Yeah.
And where you're implementing the rules. So if you're implementing some of the rules in the single page app, then really those acceptance tests will need to include the JavaScript, which would either be JS acceptance tests with a sort of mocked out backend, or would be testing the whole system through a browser.
Yeah, yes.
You'd the scope needs to include where you've implemented the rule.
Yeah.
If the rule's in the Laravel controller,
this is the problem we have. So now you hit so the.
Well, that's okay.
No,
I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
There is no rules in the React front page act in terms of business rules, right? The rules are, when the character on the left plays attacks, the animation should change so that they attack, right? Now, I wouldn't call those business rules personally, right? That's presentation. That's it's UI, just like niceties. So I don't know what we would need to do.
And then show the numbers that come back from the back end.
If we play another move and someone else can play a move, I'll play one. It's fine. Play A. Good morning, Modestus, and good morning to Brunty. We know Matt. How are you doing, Matt? So if somebody plays a move, we should see this feedback. That's like presentation to me. I'm gonna play another move because last stream we implemented the fact that if this little dude faints, there's a nice little animation to show. Like, I just want to show that off because it's like I drew all these animations myself by hand, by the way. I totally didn't buy them as a pack from I did buy them as a pack from the internet. It's fine. So anyway, now the reason that we have write control, because like this to-do file is a sad history of like what I've been meaning to do and what I've actually done over the course of this project. And write controller tests has been in here and deleted about 10 times, because if you look at the controller, and I will pull up so we have controllers, handle SMS controller, like this is like the key to the whole point of this project, because the whole point of this project is people standing at the booth at a conference should be able to send an SMS and should see the screen in front of them update, right? Because that's the whole point of this app. Let's be honest. That is the one thing it needs to be able to do. And if there's an error in here, or if there's a logic bug, or if there's just generally something that fails in here, then the whole point of this is like the biggest single point of failure in the entire thing for me. And there's no tests here. And like there is, and it's not like this is a light controller where it's literally proxying. It's just marshalling arguments from different places and pushing them. Like you can see that there's logic in here that shouldn't be in the controller. Like I know that, but this is the way that things evolve, right? Like I totally shouldn't be saying, oh, if you send more than one character in the controller, send an error back to the user. I should be handling that somewhere else. I know that. It's the way we roll, though, sometimes.
And yeah, that's big. I think that's because there's a lot of if you're just doing unit testing, there's not an obvious way to sort of unit test this. So I think let's do the example mapping, right?
Totally.
And what I think what we'll get out of that is an idea of what tests we would write in terms of what they would be testing, and a strength of having this conversation in two parts is of having this like business level conversation and then turning it into tests is then you can maybe test it at different levels over time. And that's something that the Cucumber and BHAT tools support, is that same structure of the same sort of business test case. I'm buying a product and I get charged this much and this is what the shipping is, could be applied as a end-to-end browser test. It could be applied if you've got a service that does all that. It could be an acceptance test on that service.
Yeah.
If it's one God class that handles everything, you could test that God class does the thing. If it's a controller that's doing it, it's like it gives you the framework of a test, but not really the specifics of where you're going to apply that. So we've got an example map. Shall I do a quick intro to what example mapping is? Yeah,
definitely. Like, you should assume, rightly so, that I have no idea what you're talking about, and that's good. That's fine.
Someone wants to talk about a feature. It can be they've just got a vague idea for what the feature is. It can be that over the last 6 months they've been developing a binder full of stuff that no one's read. And it's time to, and you're a sensible person, so you've actually designed your process so that at some point the business people and the development people are going to talk to each other. Often that's about a year into a coaching engagement, you manage to break down those barriers. But we're actually going to talk about it. So either I'm talking through my big requirements document, or I'm just coming in unprepared and saying, here's what we're doing next. And business people, development people, testing people, they're the sort of three people you want to check in with.
Yeah.
Because you want them to have an aligned vision of what should it do, when we implement it, what's it going to do, what are we going to be testing that it does. They call that the three amigos.
Yeah, let's not go into agile people's naming of stuff, because my blood will boil and I'll get angry. But that's fine, yeah, it's okay.
Well, someone told me the other day we're meant to say three amigos.
Oh, is it? No, yeah.
It's gender neutral that way. That's the trendy gender neutral way of saying.
For people who've joined later, Ciaran and I are old friends, and so he knows this will boil my blood, and he's deliberately teasing me, and that's fine.
Well, so it's a sort of sticky note index cards type workshop. I really find that kind of thing really, super effective, because it bridges the kind of, it makes you able to have a sort of informal conversation, informal chat, but gives you a structure to what you're talking about. So we're going to do it online.
Makes sense.
I've done it with stickies on a wall, cards on a board. There's something about, I think there's some psychological thing about like shoulder to shoulder working on a thing that breaks down a lot of formality, as opposed to sitting across a desk from each other or everyone looking at a screen.
I'd agree with that.
Let's get stuck in and start moving. It's a good leveler. So Matt Wynn came up with example mapping. He is one of the Cucumber people. He was doing lots of different workshops around this to try.
He's one of the Cucumber people, like the ones who invaded us from Planet Cucumber, and sorry.
Yeah, the software tool is called Cucumber because I think the way I heard it, Aslak, who wrote it, asked his girlfriend, what should I call my project? And they'd just been shopping, and she said, how about Cucumber?
It's the term Cucumber people. Sorry, carry on. I can't. Yeah, this is me.
Yeah. And so one of the workshops, Matt wrote a blog post about this called Introducing Example Mapping. And they had, I've got some here, a set of coloured index cards. You get a set where they're all four different colours in. And one of the participants said what the different colours represent, and Matt kind of made something up. and it kind of worked. So we've been doing it ever since. So you write the feature one. So what's the feature we're going to talk about, Gary?
Let's take a look at our feature list, which, as we've already said, is a absolute pile of crap, but it's fine. So, well, let's pick one that you think would be conducive to this. So we've got add a type system where the two people who are fighting have different types. Paper, scissors, and stone would be an easy example.
Yeah, let's do that.
Perfect.
Let's do that. Adding a type system. Right. So that's just the headline of what the feature is. You could have a user story thing there as a player. I should, and that's just because you might want to capture more than one feature in this map. You might want to talk about another one later, so we just have a nice heading. And we talked earlier about rules and examples, so we're going to have. I'm going to try and stick to the color coding that we have in the blog post. So rules are going to go here. We're going to try and figure out what are the rules. So as we're talking, every time we hear a rule, we're going to put it here and sort of grid them to the right. And, we can tear them up and split them apart and reword them and things. And then the other thing we might have are questions. And we might get some questions in the chat, actually, if we start talking about it.
Please do interact. Yeah, this is totally the point here.
And so especially because if there's more than two people... That's slightly off your screen, isn't it? I'll stick them here. I'll stick them here. You just put them somewhere. When you've got a group of people and you're all talking and you think of a question, it's really encouraged to write it down and put it in the grid. Even if you're going to talk about it in a minute, just make sure things don't get forgotten. Okay. So if I've got two questions, I'm going to write them both down, and then we're going to start talking about the first one. And then after we've finished
we
talking about it, we don't forget to circle back, right? So we get a stack of questions. I'm less strict about where you put the questions. Anywhere. Actually, the Cucumber guys do it this way. They do feature at the top and then rules underneath. And deliberately misalign them so people don't think it's this strict thing.
Yeah, because you would typically, in an ideal world, be doing this on a wall with post-it notes, right? This is the way that I've always felt is the best way, as you said, shoulder to shoulder,
or index cards on a table can be really nice if you've got a big table, because you sort of, I don't know, there's something about the body language of being like this versus being like stuck into it. But often you're working with what your meeting room looks like. And sticky notes on a wall is better if you're going to keep them there. So if you're in a big shared workspace, maybe.
Yeah, makes sense.
And they're going to stay there for the 4 days it's going to take us to build it. Why not?
Cool.
And then the other thing is examples, right? So the rule is things we hear like it should always blah, 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 blah. And then an example is, people naturally ask for examples when you're talking about things. I notice it all the time. They say, so are you saying, so what should happen in this case? Like they prompt for an example, or they give an example to make sure they've understood it. But maybe you're not capturing it. And we're going to capture some examples. And we're going to try, where possible, to scope the examples to the rules. Does that make sense?
It does.
And then, so it depends what the rule is. How many examples do you need to give of the different things that might happen? So my sales tax example from earlier in the conversation, it would look like sales tax is 20%. And then you're just capturing, like, you're not capturing all the detail of the example. You're just capturing enough to remind yourself later that you could churn it out. I think Dan North came up with this convention. He calls it like the Friends episode.
Yeah, we used to do that. That's what we used to do with the BBC. The one with because that's the title of the Friends episodes, right? So
I don't put the one where.
That's it. The one where,
every time, but it's like. So we've talked about it, and then later on, if I was in the conversation, I could write out a detailed example with that prompt.
Yes. Yeah.
So charged tenner and 167 tax.
Beautiful. if you
including
missed the start, this was the example was, I'll run over it really quickly, where if the rule is that sales tax is 20%, then we may have different conceptions of what that means, because an American may think, if I pay $10, if an item costs $10, then I end up paying $12, whereas a European may think, if I pay £10, it's already including £1.67 tax. So this is where the example really helps us to understand the rule. That was the talk we had earlier. Sorry, some people weren't here then.
And so this level of detail I've captured, that's the most I would ever write. You know, because I might have said that example out loud, but we're not slowing it down to write it all down. We're keeping enough that the people who are in the room would be able to write it out later.
Got it.
And then, like, there might be this is just from a talk.
No, it's fine. You know.
So there's a free shipping for expensive items. I need one where cheap item costs shipping.
Yeah.
And there's one where expensive basket gets free shipping. So it's almost like, what examples are we going to remember to write later? So that one needs two, because there's like two cases of what might happen. And then as you're doing it, people will maybe drill in on edge cases. So they might say, for the sales tax, they might say, oh, so you've rounded up there, have you? Right, which is quite important. And we might need to introduce a rule about how you do rounding.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then have some examples of like rounding edge cases.
Yeah. Sorry.
So that's the format. So what we're going to end up with at the end is a bunch of rules. And I think ideally every rule would have at least one example. And if there's a rule with loads of examples, maybe there's a way of splitting it into two rules.
Yeah.
Like decomposing it. It might be you're trying to express too much. And we might finish with loads of questions.
And would you remove the questions? This is probably something that will come out as we go through this, right? But would you remove the questions as we discussed them and answered them, or would you leave them on there as like part of the process?
I'd remove them if we feel like we've got an answer.
Okay, awesome.
So you might come to the end with some questions, and that'll either mean someone who was in the room just needs to think about it more and make a decision, or it might be, you know, we need to talk to someone else to resolve this. So at the end, you might feel there's too many questions to start implementing it, which is why we have this conversation a little bit before you're going to start work on something.
I hate to keep harking back, but the only place I've ever worked where this worked really well was the BBC, because they've done it for a long time. And typically, questions would be taken away by the product owner to speak to the stakeholders to get answers for. And we would do this. We would normally do this like this one before, so a sprint before the sprint, where this was we would know roughly what we were going to do 2 sprints in advance, which is kind of not in the spirit of Agile, but kind of is, if you know what I mean. We would kind of, I mean, this wasn't set in stone, but we'd have the sprint we're working on, the next sprint, and the sprint after that, and we typically do our meetings around this stuff like 1 sprint before we knew we were going to need it, because we needed the PO to go to the stakeholders and go, we have questions around these specific edge cases, what should we do?
Yeah, exactly. So if you're doing sprints and you've got that like sprint planning commitment ceremony, you want to have had this conversation about all of the things you're considering, unless they're really like trivial text changes. But you want, so in a sort of scrum type thing, I'd say a few days before the end of the sprint, you want to have talked about everything. Although having a day where you do this for every feature in the backlog can be incredibly draining, and it can be useful to just say half an hour a day, talk about a feature each day.
Yeah, that works.
That gives us 9. We can talk about 9 features during the sprint.
Thanks for the follow. I hope, can you see chat for there, Ciaran? Can you try and pronounce that name for me, because I have no idea what that name is. Yes, welcome, and it's Agile in my opinion. You can still change if thing comes up. Absolutely, you have to be prepared, right? Yeah, that's it. Yes.
Yeah. And you might have a bunch of questions still unresolved, but you say we trust each other to resolve them. Right. It might be one of the questions is how does this affect GDPR, and it means we're not going to be able to implement this feature for 6 months until the lawyers have vetted it. But it gives you that picture.
Yes. Let's do it.
So let's do it.
Type system. Let's do it. Awesome.
So what I'm going to say, there's only two of us, so it means if both of us are talking, there is like if you've got a bigger group, it's really useful if when two people are talking about something, the others are then sticking stuff on the wall that they're hearing. But I mean, we'll just do that between us.
I could like make this available to chat if you wanted, but I don't know if that would be useful. I mean, it's totally up to you, right? We can. Let's see.
You know whether you've got
no. My chat are amazing, so that's great. And hi to you, Veld. We can. So what I'd say is, chat, just shout stuff out, right? Just type it in chat. If you think of things as we are talking about things that we are not talking about, like whack it in the chat, and we'll keep checking chat and add in the tickets ourselves, right? Because
try if it's obviously if it's a question, you have a question mark, but maybe put question, example, or rule as the first. If you think you hear us say a rule, say rule, blah blah blah, and see how you phrase.
That's amazing.
So I've never played Pokemon, Gary.
You've never pronounced it either, which is nice.
Pokemon?
Pokemon, yeah. I thought you said Pokemon. I was like, Okay, this is great. So we could totally just do the basic rules of the game here, if that is easier to you. Like,
no, just explain the type system to me. That's all right.
The type system in Pokemon is that Pokemons have types, right? They are assigned a type. They are all Pokemon will have one or more types, I guess is the rule. In our game, we're only going to have 3 different types. We're gonna let's just say we're going to do that, and maybe we won't in the actual implementation. Maybe we'll do this again with chat. But let's.
What do you call your things that aren't Pokemons?
Everything's they're Chatimon for lawyers' sakes, but that's fine. We are just ripping off Pokemon, and game mechanics cannot be like intellectual property, so that's fine. We have just Chatimons in the game. This is a Chatimon, even though it's the hero, and this is a Chatimon, even though it's just 2 Chatimon fighting each other. So,
okay, so can you give me an example of a type?
Can. An example of a type would be a paper type.
What's a Chatimon would have? How would it get that paper type?
It would be born with it. Chatimon are a type. That is something that they are assigned when they are created by the game developer or the level developer or the whatever you want to say. Perfect.
Okay, so that comes from what configuration?
It comes from game design.
Or
game design, essentially. The game design would be would include what type this. So when you were designing an opponent, you would assign it a type, like before it was in the like a paper.
Okay. What's an example of an opponent that you've got?
Excellent question. Let's go and see. So, Invalid Argument is the name of a Chatimon. That's an opponent.
Okay. And what types are there? Rock, paper,
there are rock, paper, and scissors. Yeah. Anyone who's played Pokemon in the chat will be able to correct me on this, because my knowledge may be slightly askew, right? But that's fine.
Okay, so do you ever have can you have a Chatimon that doesn't have a type?
All Chatimon must have a type.
Okay.
No.
And what does the type do? Give an example of how the type would be applied.
So, if a paper Pokemon, Chatimon, we just use Pokemon, it doesn't matter. If a paper Pokemon gets attacked by a scissors move, then it's super effective, so they take 50% more damage.
And super effective is a concept you already have, or it's a new concept?
We don't. No, let's say we don't. We coded the existing combat system with the concept of effectiveness in mind, but we haven't implemented it. So that's a coding thing, right? Rather than an example thing. But the existing system has been designed knowing that we will have effectiveness come in at some point, but we haven't implemented it. That's part of this ticket, so to speak.
So super effective attacks cause 50% more damage,
and
right? It's always super effective.
Yes. If the types clash, so to speak, it'll always be super effective. If a paper I guess we should put that down as a rule, right? Because even though that's implied that everyone understands that's good.
So what's a counterexample of when that wouldn't be super effective? It's
so what we've got here is paper Pokemon gets attacked by scissors move, then it's always super effective. But if a paper Pokemon gets attacked by a rock move, then it's not very effective, I believe is the term.
And what does not very effective
50%
mean?
less damage.
Normal damage.
And if there is no type collision, then it's effective, which is 100% essentially. I'm going too fast for you to type. Thanks for the follow, Yolko. Nice to see you. I haven't seen you for ages. We hung out at PHP UK a few years ago, and it was awesome. And good morning to you, Felis. You know Felis, Ciaran, Kat. Felis will be on. I'm going to quickly do this. Felis will be on next Friday at 2 p.m. We're going to do some open source contributions together as a pair, which will be awesome. Sorry.
Okay, so what am I capturing here? So,
So I think one thing we're missing.
Just thinking how to lay it out.
One thing we're missing here is the fact that at the moment moves do not have types. So, for example, I mean, let's not muddy the waters here. The type of a attacking Chatomon is immaterial. It's the moves will have different types. So a paper Pokemon could have a rock move that it can use. I'm wondering if we should simplify that though, and I guess not, because picking the right move is kind of the crux of the fun. That's the
I mean, I think this is working out okay. So. Thank you, Felis, for the rewording. So there's a third example here, right? So paper gets attacked by paper, and it's effective.
Yeah. It's just effective, yeah.
Now, what we're not going to do here is write out every single combination. I'm actually going to simplify this because this is more than I'd actually write on a sticky note. I do. Paper is effective. Paper to rock is... And in real life, I'd have screwed up the note and thrown it on the floor.
Felis says if the moves have the type, then it should be move versus move. And that's not actually right. It's the move. It's the type of the move versus the type of the defending Chatomon is what we would be comparing here. That's kind of important, right? Because it's not the type. Yeah, sorry, you didn't put a question mark after it, so no, I'm joking. It's not. It's a really, really, really good point. That is because we need to clarify that. We need to clarify that somewhere because that is very, very important to the system.
So it's the type of... Let's capture that there. Are these correct then, these examples?
So paper to scissors is super effective. No, it's the other way around, right? Scissors to paper is super effective. Scissors move to a paper Pokemon because it cuts the paper, right?
Move. So moves have the type.
Yes. Yes. So in this instance, I'm going to quickly show the moves down here. We would add a type to these moves. So there would be a little paper symbol or a rock symbol or a, whatever the other one is that I've forgotten. Scissors symbol on the moves. And it would be up to you. And then this Pokemon would have a type that we would put somewhere up here. And the game is then picking the right move, right? But yes, both will have types. So this is the confusion that we really need to try and document here. This is the whole point that we're doing the examples, right? Is to get these confusing bits not confusing anymore. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And that's important. This is what this conversation is about, right? Making sure we both have the same, and everyone in chat has the same understanding of what goes on here. I agree. Oh,
It's possible that... Is there anything else that happens with a super effective attack apart from the damage?
no. I mean,
Okay.
It's
So something that comes up is we could...
It's so actually let's actually talk about that, because not in the code layer but at the UI layer, yes, but is that part of this feature is my question.
And it's down to the size of the feature, how small a chunk you want to deliver, right? And whether it would have value on its own. So something you find is if you've got loads of rules, you might say, actually, we can do these ones on the left this sprint, and we'll have to do the damage stuff another sprint. Maybe because there's a load of questions about damage. But we could have the UI just say it was would make a business decision. You know, would having the UI saying it was super effective.
I mean, I'm gonna do a really nice pun and say effectively all that we need to all we need to do is change one word in the UI. So in this instance, in this specific example, I'm just going to show everyone what we would do is where we have the word effective here in the front end, which just vanished for some reason, we would just say it was super effective or not very effective. So it's a very trivial UI change because we've designed the UI knowing that this would be coming down the line in the future. So maybe it's worth just ignoring that for the scope of this ticket. And
no, let's keep it in. I think it's good to this. We'll commit to it. Expand out and then decide what we're going to build. Because that's a good example of where having the business people there, they could say, just having it change the message would be a good deliverable. You can do these first three columns first, and then like we'll do the damage next week. So we don't have any questions coming in?
Nothing at the moment. Responding visually to the damage, etc. would not be a worry, correct? Yes, but
is the move scoped to the Chatamon?
So Chatamon's own moves. So in theory, like as it is coded at the moment, because why not? All Chatamon have the same moves, but theoretically, Chatamons could and should have different move sets.
So are they going to have? So are they ever going to have shared moves? Is there a situation where one Chatamon would have a move and it would be scissors, and another Chatamon would have the same move and it would be rock?
The type of the move is defined by that move, and yes, those moves are not unique to Chatamon. So, for example, in this instance, var dump is a move. If that was scissors and the hero had var dump and invalid argument had var dump, it would be the same instance of var dump in a database. For example, they would just both have that move. So yes, the move would be specific.
Yeah, and
question:
is there any relationship between what moves? Is there restrictions about what types of move a Chatamon of a particular type can have?
No, that is up to... No, there isn't. There is no system restriction. That's a game design restriction. So that's on the opinions of the people who are creating the Chatamon. You would want a paper Chatamon to have mainly paper moves, maybe one, rock move, but that's a design decision and not a system restriction.
Mm-hmm. Um, so we can easily make some examples of damage. So my assumption is normal damage is expressed as what? Points?
Yes.
Super effective would be 150.
Yes.
Which is really trivial, but it's just checked that everyone understands what percentages are
Yeah,
confusing
no,
sometimes.
that's perfect. That actually, I think it is. Kat, we apply damage as negative health, don't we? As integers. Yes, we do. We do. I can't remember, and chat always remember better than me because we coded this like November last year or something, and I'm old, so
Right, so these are super trivial.
yeah.
Um,
Yes, that's
we don't need second examples for those.
yeah,
right?
but it's good to put them down there, right? That's great. Yeah.
Is 100 a realistic value?
Let's take a look at the tests. Here's a point where we can see because the tests have real values from the real real values that we stole. Test, and I think it's the one that uses the data provider, right? Okay, now we have to figure out what these values mean because data providers suck. Minimum damage. So they're in a damage range, essentially. That's... Oh, but they will be calculated. That's fine. Yeah. So, yeah. I think, like, this is the damage range, the last two. So, 18 to 22. So, 20 would be a valid one. 75 would be a valid. There's no reason why 100 couldn't be a valid...
I'll bring it down a bit, though, just to make it not be the same numbers as the percentages. That seems like a sensible thing to do.
Let me just add a to-do for myself.
It's good to have the values be realistic because it makes people think about the real situation a bit more. It's one of the reasons to include detail. So the detail we're including, that's something to talk about, is because it's in the scope of a rule, it becomes easier to decide what detail's worth mentioning. So in these ones about the attacks, I'm not really saying the name of the attack or the type of the attack because that's not relevant to the rule we're talking about, right? In the thing about moves having types, I want to make it clear what a move is. So I've given a specific move. And we're not giving too many examples. So your data provider's got an exhaustive list of examples. We're giving enough that a person reading them would understand the rule properly. So what's going to happen is when you come to develop this, you can visually scan through and say, yeah, I've covered all of these rules. And yes, that's what my code would do in each of these cases. And when you come to write tests, each of these green things should hopefully map onto a test. If you want to.
Let's just quickly discuss this. Do different moves. So Brunty in chat asked, and I think this is out of scope of this ticket because this will be something that we've already discussed in another ticket. But the whole point of this is to make sure that everybody understands the same things, right? So questions like this would generally come up if somebody has not been in every design decision meeting or whatever. So it's totally relevant to ask that.
Yeah, I think it's fine to just say, yes, they do.
So different moves have a different damage value associated with them. Yes, they do. I'll just show it quickly because... No, it doesn't. So... So in the bottom right here, we have the chance to hit is to the left number here, and the damage. Now the power doesn't map to a damage. The whole point of this game, and this is kind of out of scope, but just for background, is that you don't know how much health. Like if you notice, these bars do not give me health values, and these power values do not give me health values. The whole point of this game is you don't know specific numbers. You just sort of get the feel for how things are doing. So in this instance, 50 will map to a damage rating that will be dependent on the And the amount of damage that is dependent on the attacking Pokemon's level and the defending Pokemon's level, and its effectiveness. So we already have that, though. We're building on top of that. But just for people to understand how this kind of works in the background.
But yeah, and like you said, that's something that would naturally come up in a big system. And actually, that's something that informs a bit of your architectural decisions. You might say that's something this code shouldn't care about, like something else. Another service does all that stuff.
And this is...
Or maybe I'm already thinking, you've got this random number. Maybe we need some concept of an object that represents that range. So we could make an assertion about what the new range looks like. So is that how we should be phrasing it here?
Actually...
An attack that would cause 10 to 30 is now going to cause...
Well, this is a very, very, very good point. This is a very good point. So... just quickly before we get on to that, Yolku says, comment, when the damage is specified as 100, I thought it was an instant kill, so now it's clearer. So yeah, that's a better thing. So the question here is, and I don't know what the answer is, and this is another good thing, so I'm going to add the question, because we definitely need to have discussion here, is the effectiveness applied before or after dice roll? Does that make sense to you? So in my mind, I always thought that we roll the dice first and then we do the multiplication on the effectiveness after we've got the number out. So the damage range would be, we roll a dice, the damage range would be 20 to 25. We get a 22 and then we multiply that by 1.5 to get the actual damage that we're doing because of the effectiveness. And I think that's how it works. Actually, you've seen this, you love this. Let's take a look, because this will be in our code how this should apply, because we already have some of this in the code. So if we go to the combat class, and if we go to the amazing algorithm that we wrote to calculate damage, yeah, here it is, which, you've seen this before at PHP UK. We actually know because the effectiveness is in here.
So when are we rounding is a good...
I mean, when are we rounding? When aren't we rounding is the answer to that.
Yeah, I wasn't sure why you were talking about the order, but actually, rounding makes a difference there, doesn't it? It's like, do we round down and then multiply by 1.5?
So my question... the type...
What? Oh, yeah. I'm going to put a question in.
The type modifiers here. Actually, I think I've got this wrong, but for the sake of this conversation, I'm fine with that. Because the type modifiers can be 0, 2.55, 10, 20, or 40. But we are implementing this ourselves, and I think 50%, 100%, and 150 is actually better. So that's fine. And we can... Yes. I think that we'll answer the question and say that the type modifier is applied after the damage range roll is done. That's what I'm going to make a decision on right now, because I'm the stakeholder and I can totally do that, right?
Yeah. So I put a question up. What do we do if the damage is odd? So here's an example of a super effective attack. Normal damage is 15. What should it be?
Yeah.
So what's the answer to that?
I don't know. I guess we round down, because we've rounded down everywhere else in the system. So let's just.
So I'm going to capture that in the rule, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we'll round down. We floored. I mean, look, if we haven't used floor enough yet, we need to be using more floor. So let's floor it. Yeah, I'm okay with that.
So that's 22.
I'm hoping you can tell me that.
I've got quite a few maths qualifications and I can't do... Yeah, 22.
There we go. Alfred has told me. It's fine.
Yeah. And when we say down, does that apply the same on the 50%? So are we rounding in the direction of 100%? So are we rounding down the amount we take off, or are we rounding down the floor? Do you see what I mean?
No. Are we rounding down the amount we...
So if you're thinking about it as 50%
Yeah.
off, then 15 we'd have to take 7 off and be left with 8.
Yes.
If you're thinking about it as reducing by 50%, reducing to half, then if we rounded down, that would be 7.
Yes. I
So
think that the
take 8
amount
off.
we take off or add on will be reduced by 50%.
Okay, so that would mirroring the other thing, that
Yes.
would be 8. So
That's a
7
really
more
good
for super
example
effect.
now, right? Yeah.
So it's good to have that in there.
Yes.
And that's answered my question. And we've been doing this for about half an hour, which tends to be about where it starts to get less productive. So we can do a bit more for the point of the stream,
No,
but do you feel like there's more?
I think
Let's cover off these
let's cover
questions,
these questions
right?
off, and then I think I'm happy because this is great.
Have we answered your first
Is
one?
the effectiveness applied before or after the roll? Yes, but I don't feel like we've written a rule down to actually. Or is there anything in the rules that says?
Well, you can start from an example if you like of how that would. Can you think of an example where that would make a difference? Stick a green one on in this, or is it an implementation detail?
I think it's an implementation detail. Yes, I think it is an implementation detail.
So,
not very effective attacks
you
cause
think
50% damage. I think that's fine. I think that wording implies that we halve the damage. That yes, I think that's fine.
And so this is like a UI question. If they're on 10 health and the attack would cause 10 normally, do we still say it was super effective?
Absolutely, yeah. It's kind of fundamental to the feedback of the player for them to know that their attack was super effective. If it was, yes, that's...
So you might not bother capturing this, but effectiveness is based on damage that could be done, not on remaining health. What was the example I just gave?
So if the health was
10, damage 10, normal damage 10.
Effectiveness is not based on damage. It is based on damage, right? That leads to misunderstanding. This is probably something we need to clarify. We've got a little bit more time. I don't want to go on too much longer, but yeah. I don't know. So, Kat...
Not on health points.
So Feeler says damage overflow is still reported. Damage overflow is actually not reported in the front end. Like, we don't... You don't know... The whole point here is that this green bar here could represent 10 health, and you could do a super effective attack that crits, because we have a concept of crit, but that does... Oh, we probably should bring that in at some point, but we'll do that on stream another time when you're not here, because we can carry on doing this, like, when you're not around. That's great. But you could do 100 damage, right? And all it would say is hero... A developer attacked invalid argument with a VAR dump. It was super effective. VAR dump has fainted. You wouldn't know that you did this massive attack that would have put their health bar to minus 1,000. It would just be reported the same way. And that was a question that Felix asked. So that's cool. And effectiveness is not based on damage. I didn't actually understand that.
Okay.
Effectiveness is...
Let's go to... So... opponent health,
yes,
is 10. Attack is paper to rock.
Yes.
And would cause it would be enough to kill them if it was normal effectiveness. Is it super effective still?
Yes.
So it's only going to deduct the amount of health that a normal attack would. Do we still count that as? Do we still classify that as super
So
effective?
the effectiveness calculation, I've added the word calculation here because the effectiveness is, as Kat correctly said, is the effectiveness is something we determine on move type versus Chatham on type, and the effectiveness calculation is actually the modification, and the effectiveness calculation is completely irrelevant of the. Yes, it does not depend on opponent health. So if the opponent health is 10 and the attack is paper to rock and it would cause 12, it's still super effective. Yeah, that's good. That's good.
And this is the kind of negative negative example, right? Where you've only put it there because a dummy in the room asked the question, and you say, no, that's not how it works, and you give it like a clarifying example. So if this is like, the timer's gone off, we'll lose the meeting room.
But
we got quite far. I think that was about 30 minutes.
I think it was. And in all honesty, I feel like if we were doing this in an agile environment, I feel like we would have done enough here for this ticket to go on to into the backlog and be ready to be picked up in the next sprint, to be honest. Like,
yeah, I think that's often the case, right? The only time you that's about enough time for someone to understand the requirement well. And a lot of that was about the questions we were asking and the answers we're giving. The map is really just giving you that a bit of structure. The things that tend to get in your way are, some accounting question and we need some specialist to answer, some integration with another team. Actually, sometimes, because you're basing this on Pokemon and you made a decision at one point, didn't you? You made a rounding decision. If it's like a really business critical thing, you might need to go say, actually, I need more time to think about that and think about the consequences it would have for the whole system. So it's common to end up with a few questions that someone has to go and resolve. I would also say it's quite wide-ish, and when we're doing sprint planning, we could, if the team are saying, "Oh, there's no way we're going to get all this done," we could group them this way, right? And say, okay, so in this sprint we're going to do. Is that fitting on your screen?
Yeah.
Cool.
And
in the sprint, we're going to do the type system, and in the other sprint, we're going to do what we're going to call them effectiveness.
Yeah, and that's
damage.
Really very, very common, particularly with things like feature flags, which are popular, where you cannot turn the feature on because, like, we would. I think that if I was going to do this, if we were doing this as part of a sprint, I would say one ticket would be, and this is really common for us when we were at the BBC, where we would say one ticket is figuring out what the database changes should look like and implementing them. That's a ticket. And so, because that's like something you need to discuss technically with your peers to say, I'm proposing these are the database changes we should do. And now I'm going to, and there's a meeting, probably not, maybe not a meeting, but a pairing session or a conversation then, which is a better phrase around that. And then, implementing them with a pull request so that you make migration changes or you do all that good stuff with the pull request. That would be one ticket. And then the next ticket, which would depend on that work being done, would be, okay, now we can implement the type system. We can do all this good stuff. Now, I've spoken to people who feel like tickets should be more isolated than that and shouldn't depend on other tickets. But, I think that's down to opinions, personally.
Yeah, I'm just, while we're talking, I'm refining it.
Of course you are.
Yeah, and Yolkus asks, should that go in the backlog? I guess he means the damage ticket, which is that side. It depends if the team think they want to, if it's small enough to build it all in one go. The thing you're talking about, the splitting. If you think it's like a chunk that's enough to tackle as one feature, you can keep it all together. It's just a nice way of splitting. Mike Cohn has this acronym SPIDER. Oh, why have I said this? I'm going to have to remember what the 5 things stand for. But it's
Mike Cohn, you said.
Yeah, COHN. Different ways of splitting stories. So the R stands for rules, and that's what we're doing here. So we're splitting it based on rule. S is spike, so it's like splitting it based on knowledge. Yeah, have a quick look at the poster. It's probably copyright, but I'm sure you can stream it.
It's right here, look. Yeah,
Oh, there you
spike.
go.
A research activity can give you the knowledge you need to split a complex story, yeah.
So you say, it's too big to take on, but I can do this bit of research. Like you chip a bit off. Paths is like if there's different journeys, user journeys that it impacts, just support one of them first. So we only give discounts if they're doing this type of purchase.
Is the typical one to take first, right? And then look at edge cases and more. Yeah.
Yeah, or interfaces is kind of something like different devices, or it's only there on the admin, or it's only there on the new interface. Data, which is what made me think of it, only support it for certain types. Like maybe you're working on a database where some of the, all the records that are based in Italy have this extra bit in them we don't know how to process, so we do it for everyone that isn't in Italy. So like there are certain records that don't have the complexity in. And rules here is kind of what we're doing. We're saying rules is useful if the business are happy deploying these things separately, which is kind of what we were talking about. You want all these. A business can think in business rules, right? Each of these things is going to give us something. I think the first two are a bit weak. Right. The first two in our map, Chattermons have a type, moves have a type. I think it's good to have them in the map and to have talked about it, but I think I now understand those.
I think
like I've got that all the other rules I kind of understand.
And I do feel like in the real world. So what's happened here is you've come in as a whatever you want to be, the business analyst, the product owner, whatever, right? But you've come in as one of these roles to this.
Yeah.
And it would be very, very rare for you to be having these conversations with somebody who has no prior knowledge. Like typically, it can happen, but typically people who will be sitting in these meetings with you will have been in many other meetings before. There's a shared pool of assumed knowledge where you don't need to cover the basics of this stuff.
Yeah, but maybe the types might be a completely new concept that we've not had before. But I think maybe I wouldn't be sort of thinking about those as things that can be implemented on their own. I wouldn't. I mean, you could, right? I think that's what your example with the BBC. You could introduce Chattermons have a type.
And you know, we probably would have. This is how we would have worked out. We would try and get story points, and I'm not a big fan of story points, but look, if you're going to have an arbitrary number to say how big a job is, that's fine. Let's not go there. But we would try and make our story points and this was a developer team. We were a 3-person developer team, and our decision as a developer team we would rather have 100 things in the sprint at 1 story point than 10 things at 10 story points. And that was, I feel like that was the developer team choice rather than anything else, right? So we would split things down into ridiculously small chunks. And that was just personal preference, essentially.
And there's 2 directions you're slicing in, right? One direction is what the business sees as a deliverable. So it's like definition of done type thing. So we've got this big list of work, and we'll call this feature done at these points that the business cares about. But then within each feature, you're either sub-slicing or you're slicing at a different angle of like, at what point am I going to make a commit? At what point am I going to make a pull request? At what point am I happy for this to go onto a live server behind a feature flag, even? And there's an interaction between those two. So I think something from this map that's interesting to talk about is I've put them in a bit of an order now, left to right. If I was working on this, because I work in a sort of BDD test first way, I would take that left-hand Chattermons have a type, and I could implement that end to end and make a commit.
Yes.
Right. And I could feature flag that. I can talk to the business and say, would it be valuable for me to deploy? Look, all the Chattermons now have a type, and it's through to the UI. Is it a bad thing if we deploy that and it doesn't actually affect anything? And the business might say no, so I have to put a feature flag, but I've done that work and I've committed it, and I've tested it. And then I add types to the moves maybe next, which is like a data up approach like you were talking about. Maybe I need to talk to some other teams about the database. And then I can say, well, each attack gets labeled with an effectiveness.
With a type, yeah. Sorry.
Moves have type. Is attacks the wrong word there?
Moves. Yeah, attacks are the wrong words.
What do you call the thing where it's been resolved and we've worked out the damage?
I've broken everything. There you go. So
it's like an applied move.
So moves are given an effectiveness. No, attacks are given an effectiveness. Yes, you're right. Attacks is exactly the correct word there. Moves are the list of things that we see in the UI here. Attacks are the application of a move to a defending Chatimon. So yes, that's the right phrase.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that in terms of my workflow, if I want to be deployable every 3 or 4 hours, I can work through the rule on a rule by rule basis. That can be a nice way of working. And it's just a decision of at what point does the stakeholder say that's deployable.
And I feel like that is exactly how when I felt like I'm working in super productive teams, that's the way that I feel like has always worked best for me. And this is totally opinionated because some teams will work better with 15-point tickets assigned to one person. Other teams will work better with 3 points. I know that it's kind of implied that smaller tickets are better, but sometimes that's impossible. So. But yeah, and this is exactly like when we come to implement this, which will be, what day is it? Oh, it's a bank holiday tomorrow. So it'll be like early next week. We will start coding on this. And this is exactly how I will attack it, right? I will go, okay, all Chatimons have a rock, paper, scissors type that never changes from game design. Cool. Let's go to see how...
And you can do that for your whole stack.
Let's take a look at the Chatimon object. Like we have we've misnamed it, but it's called a combatant, which is a terrible name from when we were first writing this, and we may want to refactor as part of this. That's fine. But I'll be right. Okay, we don't have a type in here, so this ticket, because this is not persisted in a database, this is persisted in like a document store, so I can just add stuff here. But yeah, like I would start attacking this by going type. Okay, how is this supposed to look? Well, I probably need a defined list of acceptable types, blah, 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 blah. And that's how I would start doing this. This is exactly how I would do it. Now, what I would probably do is if I was ticketing this out, and we'll go through this really quickly, but if I was ticketing this out, I would do the UI work as one ticket at the end, right? So, or maybe not at the end, maybe not necessarily at the end, right?
I think it depends on how long it takes.
So what I wouldn't do is say all Chatimons have a rock, paper, scissors type that never changes. I would imply this, write the test based on the example, but the UI wouldn't change.
And that could be a unit test, or you might not even write a test.
And it wouldn't because adding the types into the background for the Chatimon and for the moves until I've implemented the fact that the effectiveness is calculated and the damage is calculated is actually totally, like, the end user, it's immaterial to them, right? The fact that in the database or in the data structure we now have the concept of types makes no difference to the game. It just sits there doing nothing. So I could just do that. I can just...
Well, it might be a sort of brand... It might be something... So it's a conversation you'd have, right? Is it going to help the branding of the game if they've all got a type icon that is surfaced through the UI?
And maybe, that's a very valid point. And maybe...
Like, would our players get some kind of enjoyment from that, even though it doesn't affect the game at all?
Maybe, yeah. Like, yes.
That's where you do have to still talk to business people. And this is the Three
Amigos approach, right? This is when you're discussing this, how you're going to tackle it, having the product owner who's representing your users, and kind of give their opinions on that is important.
And equally, in sprint planning, depending on what system you're writing, they might say we've only got time to do that first bit, that we can put types on the moves and the things, and that's actually going to fill the sprint because it's such a complex system. Is that still worth doing? So you might have that first bit of like have a feature called types. Yeah. And then another feature is like effectiveness.
I think that's
a lot of it depends on how big these things are in
this is
practice.
The skill. This is the skill. And we'll start to wrap up. But this is what I feel when teams start working very effectively. I feel like this is stuff that in teams I've worked in where I feel like we've started to hit that. I guess we use the term velocity because I hate all that stuff, and it's just opinions based on my own experiences. And I've done that one job where I didn't hate it so much because it was working well. But I guess when I've been in teams that have been working at a very high velocity, where I feel like we haven't really hit barriers a lot because we've done good conversations beforehand, we've done good planning. Everything's ready for me. When I pick that ticket up, I don't have lots of questions because we've already got them answered. I'm working with engineers who I know how they code review, so I'm almost coding to pass their code reviews up front rather than then, that. And the tickets are a really nice size, so you can keep momentum going. You can get that satisfaction of closing tickets and deploying. That's when things are all rosy in the garden, and it's a really good feeling for me.
Yeah.
And my last question is, if you were going to implement this now in that code base, would you be looking to use something like would you be looking to use PHP unit to write these examples as tests, or would you try and use something else, specifically this code base?
Let's talk about that. Let's go left to right, and you can tell me. So these first two, the types, would you write a test for that?
When you design an opponent like invalid argument, you give it a type paper. I probably would already have a test that I would modify, if the truth be told here.
I mean, it might just be something you put into the type system, right? If you put a type value object as a constructor thing, maybe you don't need to test that. How do these things get into the system? Is there a user interface where someone puts?
There would. So
maybe you'd write some sort of UI test around that makes the form. Tell them if you were bothering doing that. You might have some sort of where does this thing get into the system? It has to have a type. Or you might say, well, the object has that value object, so if someone submits the form wrong, they'll get a 500.
Yeah,
doesn't matter.
I guess so. I guess my answer there would be it'll probably involve updating an existing test, but I wouldn't specifically write a test for that.
Yeah, and what I mean is if you make it part of your type system, you maybe don't need to modify the UI because the UI can't do the wrong thing. You'd write a test around that, setting up an opponent form if you wanted to give them a better error message. So the first two, maybe let's not think about tests. And we've got a concept that's come out from the conversation. I think it's already in your system. Is the types classify an attack as at an effectiveness level, and then that effectiveness level applies to the damage, which is a good insight.
I agree.
First thing we wrote down was it causes 50% more damage, and then through the conversation we got this concept out of effectiveness. So I'd write probably these three tests.
I think I would want to do that. I would want to write those three specific tests
at some level.
And in all honesty, I would probably do that at a unit level because I know how we've written the code base, and I can think. I'm already thinking how I would implement this as code.
Yeah. So you might call some function and check that the thing that comes back is a super effective type.
That. Yeah.
You might also do you then need to test it? You might have the same three test cases in your UI.
Yes.
Because you might want to check that it's super effective and it's shown on the screen.
If we had UI tests, we definitely would want to do that. I mean, we don't. Yeah. I hazard to think about how we would actually write tests that can interact with a UI via text message or Twitch chat. But, these problems are solvable, right? You create some kind of mock way of doing it. So you might decide
you might put that in the manual testing category. You could probably
trigger this via JavaScript directly to an API endpoint that, it's fine. We could do that. But, yeah, I think that's a very valid point.
And at your unit level, you might want to write more tests, right, for all the different combinations in a data provider.
That's really interesting, actually.
but these three are the ones we want to say to the customer, we've tested that this
Yeah.
works. And the manual testers looked at this list. So even if you're not automating the tests, the manual tester was in the conversation. So when they load up the game, they're going to check these three cases. So we are sort of testing it at that level. We've just checked that we've written it down.
Yep. Amazing.
There's a step missing out, which is the middle step is you would go away and put some more detail on these things if you needed. So we've made little notes. You'd write them out nicely and keep them somewhere. Stick them in a Jira or something.
This would be turning the rules from all Chattermans or moves have their own types is a better example, right? Because that's very succinct and nice. To given I'm a Chattermon and I'm whatever, however you actually turn them into technical tickets you can work on, right? We used to be much less precious, and we would have a lot of just brain dump type stuff in there from conversations, so that at least it was all in one place. But yeah, I agree. Cool.
Yeah. If you're using BHAT or Cucumber, you'd probably start writing them out in that given when then. And something that's been added to Cucumber, to the Gherkin syntax, is this rule keyword. So you can write a feature and then indent, write a rule, and then indent and write an example, and then give the steps of the example. So that can be a good format for collaborating if you're going to use Cucumber to automate. If you're going to use your PHP unit tool, I think it's good to have some way of linking that test back to this discussion somehow. Or it can be just be tagging things against where you keep the
It's a really bad example here because we don't have tickets. Because yes, I would commit with the ticket number in if we had tickets, so that I can see what changed as part of this ticket number and that this change was part of this ticket. And yeah,
but you've got version control, which PR is part of. So
I mean, we have version control where I just do git push origin master at the end of every stream. Yeah, but that's fine. This is a real world example of a non-real world example, if you know what I mean, because this is me hacking on something for my own use and on stream and trying to hit deadlines of conferences which I no longer have. So there's no excuses anymore. Let's be honest. Like, I have no excuses for this being terrible now because I've got all the time in the world to be working on it. So,
and those other examples, that you take a similar approach. You'd decide where to test it, and you'd make sure you know where the test is. Yoku's asking how to link this to the code. The way I tend to work, I don't keep the example map around. I turn it into quite often a sort of Gherkin document that maybe lives in a Jira or something, and then at some point you implement it, and then that feature becomes part of your code base. So that in the sort of Cucumber workflow, this written out English natural language examples would be committed with the code that implements it, and then automate at different levels.
Yeah, and I feel like it's more important. You turn these into tickets, right? The next step from here is from the examples into tickets. In my experience, in the real world, the next thing you would now do is, and whether, like, we were super lucky, we had a BA who would just take this and turn it into tickets for us, and that is a privilege and a pleasure, because anything you can do to work, not be creating stuff in Jira is a big win. But yeah,
I think it's quite important for the people who are in the conversation to then read that and sort of say, yeah, that's what we talked about. And that doesn't take very long. If the way, when the person's making the Jira ticket or whatever system, they're really just writing down what we talked about. So when I read it, I should recognize it and just be going, yep. And then something that's different to what I remember should jump out at me.
And I think it's important to realize that what we're looking at here is atypical, because as we discussed at the beginning, a lot of these could be physical post-it notes. Or how do you link a pull request back to a physical piece of post-it note that's now scrunched up in the bin because somebody else needed to use the wall? Like, it's
you can't. So that's why it's important that the pull request includes a recap of what the feature is. So if I'm using Cucumber, if I'm using BHAT, which is the PHP Cucumber, I'm also committing a feature file, and the feature file should, to anyone who's in this conversation, it should be really familiar. Here's a feature. here's the rules, here's examples of the rules. Each example would have these steps in, given when then steps. But I should be able to read the pull request and say, okay, that's what we talked about. At that point, you can throw away the example map, and your repository then has a load of feature files explaining what the system does. If you want to see a good example of this, there's the Cilius e-commerce project. They're really big into BHAT, and nearly all of their features are there in the repository. Yeah. So you read the repository, and here's an example of how our system operates. I actually know I heard of a company who are using the rule keyword in the features, and they're using the features to find out what their business rules are. So they parse their code base to find out what their policies are.
So like, and this is the stuff, and I'm sorry if I don't know how we're looking for time, Ciaran. Sorry, I know I'm monopolizing you, but this is the stuff. I love this. I love the fact that we've had conversations that have surfaced rules and edge cases and examples. I love it, and I feel like as a stream, and those people who've been around as we've built this game. Those people have been around from November, and I'm looking at Kat, who's in the chat, and Steve King, who's not here today, and other people will know that this is actually what we do when we start writing this. It's just we don't do it formally with Post-it notes and capturing things efficiently. I sit down and start coding, and then I go, so should super effective attacks cause 150% damage, round it down or round it up? And we'll kind of the chat will come at me, and I'll go, yeah, I agree, round it down. Like, so... This is the same conversation.
That's a really interesting point. I think that if you're doing mob programming or pair programming, this is maybe less important. I think a lot of developers are working in a situation where they're just sitting there on their own, and a lot of testers are, and they've been delivered this feature and they have to sort of make sense of it. So some of the strength of the process can be getting those people in the room for half an hour at the start, creating a shared understanding of what they're going to be doing, and then when they're doing their individual bits, they can sort of remember what we talked about. There's some documentation about, the outputs from the workshop. The workflow I'd use if I was using BHAT would be either you or me will then go away and make a feature file based on these. You'd say to the person, can you validate this is what we talked about? The developer would use that feature file to decide what tests to write as part of the thing, because that's what Cucumber does, right? It connects that written thing with the tests. Yeah, if you're using PHP unit, that's still fine. You need to create that connection yourself through tagging or like hyperlinks in comments or however you want to do it, to sort of make sure everyone's referring back to the conversation we had. Now, it's still agile. You still might change your mind, but at least you've got a record of like, here's what we thought when we started.
So we're having the conversation because I have the people who I want, whose opinions I want, with me while I'm coding it, right? So in some ways, these it's a complete luxury, and also means that I don't have, like, I have much smarter people than me making my code better, which is great. But in some ways, this is the perfect example of agile, because you should be having conversations just in time, and this is exactly just in time conversations, right? But in the real world, that's virtually impossible. Like, very few bosses are going to say, yeah, let's just get 10 of you coding at the same computer on one feature, right? It just doesn't happen. Look at me pretending I normally get 10 people on stream. Let's say 3 people even, right? It's just like getting people to pair. I know real world people have said, like, getting their boss to agree that for them to pair can be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. So yes, this is about formalizing the process, so you're having the conversations just in time, and it's brilliant.
Yeah, and it's hopefully not too formal. It's not.
Yeah, formal's the wrong word. I mean,
try not
arranged
structured
is the word, I think. And also don't forget that in the real world, I would need to have the stakeholders on my stream to answer questions just in time as well, because I'd be like, oh, just in time. Okay. We can see that we need this graph to display in the ticket, but does the graph supposed to be the gross or the, or not? And then I would need to have the person in the stream or in the room with me going, yeah, it's that, so it's just not conceivable. You're right. This is great, though. Honest question, yeah. Would you say now, if I were going to implement this on Monday, that I should take a look at BHAT and maybe knock up some feature files for this and just as a learning exercise, I guess, more than...
If you want to do it as a learning exercise, but I don't really advocate doing that on a existing code base if you've got tests in place. I think the most useful thing you can have is knowing which tests are the business acceptance tests, and have some way of, what I want at the end is to be able to say, I know that all of these things are tested at some appropriate level.
Yeah, you can see the depth of my attempts to write tests that are more than just unit tests, and this is something I've always struggled. I'm pretty good at writing unit tests, even in legacy code bases. I'm pretty good at either, if I'm not allowed to refactor, then shoehorning tests in with mocks that are horrible and awful practices to pull stuff out of the container or whatever. But
I think you're doing unit tests, right? So you're testing the class level. A sort of container level is a nice place to test these kind of things.
And this is the attempt I had to write a controller test, which ended up, and it literally got to the point where I just got so angry with how difficult it was to set up all of the, because essentially, right, the greatest thing about these unit tests are, I set up some state, I run some command, I check that the state has been mutated in a way that I expect, right? That's essentially what I'm doing here. And that is, there's literally minimal dependencies. We depend on a randomizer, so we mock that so that we have predictable randomization. Or, this is relatively straightforward stuff, right? But then when you get to the controller stuff and you're like, okay, I'm relying on a third-party framework, and now I need to be able to set... So, essentially, I've always been of the belief that when you do a controller test, it should be like any other class. Because a controller is just a class, right? Just a class where you can call... And this is probably massively to do with my opinions and thoughts on this kind of stuff. Because, we've got this handle SMS controller and we have an invoke function. So, in my mind, I should be able to pass in a request object and a logger, and then I should be able to call something and see what's being returned by this method of this class. And that, in my mind, should be really simple, but because we're using Laravel and all the magic is done behind the scenes to set all this stuff up before it even gets invoked in the real world, it's painful.
Yeah.
Now,
I used to write unit tests for controllers in Symfony, but I've kind of stopped doing that because... Why have I stopped doing that? Because I tend to be testing that whole set of objects anyway, and the controller is just a sort of front for a whole network of objects that are doing the job, if you see what I mean. So if you're moving your... I think something that's important to realize is the kind of business acceptance tests we're talking about, it's very rare that you can test that in a unit test, like a proper unit test, because business requirements are complex and we try and keep our classes simple. And we try and keep the complexity in the way the classes are talking to each other. So if you've got a complex business requirement and you can test it just by, you can write a test that resembles the examples we came up with and just test one object, that object's going to be massive and really complicated.
Yeah.
So you kind of expect that to test these business rules are implemented in your system, you need to get a load of objects together, plug them together in the correct way, and then invoke them. So maybe that's wrapped in maybe a container's doing all that plugging together for you. That's fine. Yeah. I quite often write tests that pull out a service from a container and call its methods and check the right things happened. If you can test it with a unit test, your unit's probably too big, or it's a really trivial business rule.
And also, I feel like what I took away from this. So there's two things I took away from this. Number one is, I wish that frameworks, all of them, not Laravel, specifically treated controllers as just another class without things being set up for you. So I would like to be able to write a controller that is essentially this without the extends. Class, handle SMS controller, a constructor where I do my dependencies, which can come from a container. That's totally fine. That it magically, like, because this is part of a container, this is going to be invoked through a container, so therefore its dependencies can be fulfilled through that container. That's fine. But I think there's that. And the other thing is, what I would do in the real world here is make this class almost pointless to be unit tested because there would be no logic in it. So I should be abstracting this logic into something that can be easily unit tested as a small unit. I should be, there's way too much logic in this controller, which is why I really want to test this, is because I have critical business logic in a place where it shouldn't be.
Yeah, so that's a private method on the controller, is it?
Yes, this is a private method on the abstract class.
I would use that as a guide and see if you can turn those places where you're calling a private method into places where you're calling methods on a service that you get from the container.
This is exactly why we are very, very quick to... So the way this has come about is exactly why we're all incredibly quick to criticize other people's code in legacy code bases. Like, why would you even do this? And I'm like, do you know what? I'd really like... I'm going to finish the stream in 20 minutes, and I'd really like to get this done. So let's just hack this in now, and then next stream we'll make this better, right? And Kat will tell you, because they've been here for nearly all of the streams. And then I'm like, do you know what? This works. I'm just going to leave it in now. Who cares? And that is a real world of how these things happen, right? It totally is. And what I find...
So I should say I haven't extensively used Laravel.
No, this isn't really even Laravel, though. This is not anything to do with Laravel. This is to do with me thinking, oh, I need to have this make combat thing. What I should do is create its own factory that does this, but I'm just going to chuck it in here for now. And the for now is exactly why this lives in the code forever. Like, and it's writing the tests that keep me honest. That's my own personal opinion on this. Is if I was doing this in a commercial capacity where I would have to make sure this was testing, this couldn't live here for now because it would make the tests so difficult. I would be forced to refactor this into a more sensible place. But that's just personal,
So you can move that into an object that's a service, right? And then get the Laravel container to inject that into the controller.
Yes, absolutely. And then this is, so look, you can see that we already have some factory stuff that essentially this is factory stuff, right? This is a factory. Its job is to create a combat object all ready to be used in the application, right? That's what it is. And so it should be a factory, right? Even its name tells you that it should be a factory for me. Like, make a combat class. It's bad, but it's fine, we live. Anyway.
And are there other private methods that are doing similar things that would also move to the same service?
No, because but I'm calling it in multiple places, but everything extends this base controller. So, this controller, this abstract class. So it's not this isn't the worst thing in the world. Let me make that clear. But it's a very good example of why the code that you see in the Chatterman namespace is very clean, and I'm quite okay with it. I mean, there's loads of to-dos, make this better all over it, but I would, I'd be happy to ship that code. Whereas the code that's outside of that namespace is all bodged and
yeah. So what I would say is if you put all of the logic that's currently existing inside the controllers into services, you would probably be able to feel that all the things you feel like you need to test,
Absolutely.
all the business logic things you need to test, you can test in the services instead and forget about the controller. And the controller's just doing request response redirect stuff. So the business logic stuff can shift into service tests, and the sort of UI stuff can shift into your end-to-end UI tests.
You've hit the name right. You've hit the nail right on the head, and
and you don't feel like you need to test controllers anymore.
And that's exactly yes, 100% yes, because
that's the journey I took over the last 8 years with Symphony. Symphony controllers got easier and easier to test.
You 100%. I think
they don't extend anything, and as that got easier and easier to test, I stopped testing them because I don't put stuff in the controller anymore.
So that's definitely a refactor I need to do, and you can see right here, and I literally said, oh look, it's exactly what you said, right? We've been in a stream, we've written a Python bot that sits in chat and turns it into a webhook into our Laravel app so we can play this through Twitch, and that was cool. And then I'm like, oh, all I have to do now is write the controller, and that should be really easy because it's like nearly exactly the same as the SMS controller. So I'll create a new controller and copy and paste it, and you can see these two are two different controllers with stuff that like totally should be not in, do you know what I mean? This is like, oh look, this same to do for hacky nonsense is in two different files. That's obviously, this needs to be abstracted and refactored and made better. So
it gets a combat based on what?
The
combat is just like a fresh object.
No, it actually pulls it out of the persistence layer, which is a Twilio product called Sync.
Okay. So it's getting it from a repository type thing.
Yes, essentially. Like it's just like a hosted MongoDB instance, for want of a better word.
Okay, so I'd think of it as a repository.
So we pull out get combat document that actually pulls it out of the repository, which is in this case an HTTP request, but trivial implementation details. Yeah.
So that's something that you could have an interface around.
Yeah.
So it gets the combat and then it saves it again afterwards, right?
Yes.
And all of the logic of what happens when you take your turn is already in the combat object.
Yes. So essentially what we do is we pull the combat out of the repository. Ignore them making a new combat when we start a new combat.
I mean, it doesn't sound like there's much logic in the controller already.
I mean, no.
All you maybe could maybe get on the left-hand controller, line 34 and line 35, you could move that into a service.
I think that's what would be better here, yes, I agree.
And in fact, you're not using combat until you could move line 26 where you get the combat. You could move that to line 33, right?
Yes.
So let's just do that refactor because we know that's safe. And the only thing would be if it throws an exception, I guess, because you've got quite a wide.
Yes.
Exception.
Hang on. Let's just. Whoa. How do I make this not split screen? Because my eyes. Oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
You asking me how to use PHP still?
Shush. It's fine. Yeah. You're.
Right, and then those three lines, you could push them into a private method. So something I find quite interesting is people often put persistent stuff in the controller, but is it really the controller's responsibility? Maybe there's a service that does that.
I would.
The taking turns service.
I would normally make this a service and not have this stuff in the like. I say normally, like if this was commercial code.
So, but if you extract those three lines to a private, it can be a service later. What's left that feels bad?
What are we going to call this? We'll call this naming is the worst thing. Let's call it
take turn.
And it takes the logger, a move index, the from country, and the from number, which is actually a perfectly fine refactor in there.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, and the logger would go away if it was a service, right?
Yeah,
because it can depend on the logger service. So that would be quite a nice.
Yeah, the reason this is so yes, this is exactly what it should be, because if it was a service, it would be pulling the logger out of the container as part of its constructor. Yeah, Felix says, welcome to the stream where every week Spabby asks, how do I regarding PHP Storm? And you wonder why I was sacked from working at JetBrains, right? It's fine. It's totally fine.
I can't ask you for a license anymore.
Yeah, Yeah, you're right. Anyway, we'll wrap this up because we've been going
So you can sort of see how that would evolve, right? That would become a taking turns
Yes.
service. And I think a lot of your examples from the map would then be method calls on that are just primitives from the control. So the controller's job is mapping the request into these scalar values,
Yeah.
calling the
Yeah.
service, and then you can do a lot of testing at that layer and not care about all that stuff that's in the
I
controller.
think this is incredibly valid, and I think that then this controller is still not too trivial because I do want to check that if this regular expression isn't matched, that we return an empty string. So I would write a controller test for this, but because I've abstracted all of the logic into a service, writing the controller test should be, pretty trivial, right? At this point.
What's the case when that wouldn't match?
So if I type,
We've
so
posted
so
something
I'll
back.
explain this to you in. So the Python bot that takes our Twitch chat from in the bottom right here and turns it into a webhook to the PHP application.
Hmm.
Everything, there is no logic in there. It proxies. Its job is to literally take Twitch chat and make a PHP request and make an HTTP request to the PHP app. So if, and this regular expression said it should look like play C, and if it doesn't look like play C, we just ignore it because this isn't a play command.
Yeah.
Thanks, Felix.
So that's something.
So this is saying, this isn't meant
That's
for me. This is not even a request that's meant for me. Just ignore it.
that's something that you could cover in a end-to-end test as
Yeah.
well, right? So I find that the stuff that I feel like I need to test in controllers, if I'm pushing stuff into services and testing it there, it's either stuff I test in a UI test or it's stuff I just don't
I mean,
test
yeah.
because who cares?
I should totally be hitting handle Twitch, and then with a post request where I've set up the post so that it has whatever message key that is
Mm.
like this. That would be a massively more valuable test. So that then I say, well, when the message is hi, I get back an empty string, right? Whereas when the message is play C, I get back thanks my name, which is also in the post. You played move C. Like that is valid, isn't it? And that's
Mm.
better. Okay, cool. Cool.
Because so it's better to test it just at the controller level if you're not going to write any end-to-end tests. If you are going to write end-to-end tests, it's probably enough.
I agree.
Good.
Yeah.
This has been
It
fun.
has been fun. Thank you so much for your time. Right, so you totally should hire
I'll try and
Ciaran
actually
if you want to get more of this good stuff at your. I know you won't self-promote, so I'm going to do it for you. You should totally hire Ciaran if you want to get Ciaran in to do this stuff in your own business. I guess remotely at the moment, Ciaran, but normally you like to get in the same room, right? That's fine.
Yeah.
How do people get in touch with you if they're interested in chasing you up on this stuff?
Uh, DM me on Twitter.
Okay, at Ciaran McNulty.
Ciaran
Yeah,
McNulty.
I'll
Yeah.
stick that. That's fine.
DMs are
Yeah,
open.
that's good. And yeah, awesome. So next up, we have Kat coming on. We're going to do some open source contributions. There's a breath open PR that I've been meaning to do forever, and I've decided I'm going to do it on stream, mainly because I think we'll do it from the very beginning to the end. So we'll fork the repository. We'll just literally show you if you've ever thought about how to start getting involved in open source, but you honestly don't know where to start. We will be doing everything from the beginning to the end to making the PR. It's quite a small change. So the coding stuff will be relatively straightforward, but it's more about like the process and the thought and the thinking and how to do it. So that's awesome. And Phyllis also had a crazy idea, so this could be even more interesting. Amazing. Thank you so much, Ciaran. I mean it. I really do. Like, as you can see, I could talk to you about this stuff for hours because it's intriguing to me.
Yeah, it's
It
been
really
good.
is.
It's been good to actually get a chance to do it.
So, yes, thank you very much. No stream tomorrow because it's a bank holiday here in the UK, so I'm going to sit in the garden and drink beer. Because it's traditional, right, in the UK for us to do that. But Monday we will be streaming. I guess we'll be working on Chatting On. We've got a new feature like spec'd up now, so we'd be remiss if we didn't actually start coding on it.
Right.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, and goodbye.